Welcome to Coyote's Corner. This episode, we'll be listening to Michael Lang tell a historically inspired tale, The Truce of Flanders Fields.
In Flanders Fields, on a moonlit night before Christmas, all was calm, all was quiet. Even the rats who would often grow to the size of London alley cats, even they were hunkered down beneath the pallets and the duckboards of the trench's walls and floor. There stood the sergeant upon the fire step, keeping watch over his squad by night. The machine gunner beside him shifted his weight. The sniper stifled a yawn. They suddenly heard a sound from beyond the barbed wire of no man's land. It was not the thunder of artillery or the roar of German guns. It was Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, alle schlaft, Eisen wacht. The British soldiers could not believe their ears. The Germans, murmured the machine gunner. They're singing. What do we do? Asked the sniper. But before the sergeant could say a word, they once again heard the Germans singing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, alle schlaft, Eisen wacht, round young virgin mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild. The sergeant did not know the German words, but he knew the melody well, and he could not help but join in. Soon the machine gunner and sniper, they were singing as well. The men sleeping below the fire step, they stirred and began to awake. Schlaft and Emily shall rue, sleep in heavenly peace. As the last notes faded into the night, the sergeant saw movement in the moonlight. He instinctively reached to the holster at his hip. The machine gunner tightened his grip on his trigger. The sniper took aim. But it was not a weapon rising from the distant German trench. It was a flag of truce. All eyes turned to the sergeant. He paused for a moment, consideration. Why not? It's Christmas. A flag was soon fashioned and held aloft. Then the soldiers began to clamor from both the British and the German trenches. They carried biscuit tins and metal canteens. Some were even clutching the flasks and bottles they'd acquired through unofficial channels. They picked their way through the snow and the barbed wire of no man's land. They offered awkward handshakes to the men who had been their enemies through the early months of the war. Cheers, mate. Prost. Tin cups clinked and thumped as a toast was offered to Christmas. They stood about, not knowing what to do next. As a British soldier packed his pipe, a German officer politely offered him a light. The match was shaken and tossed away without a care. That was when an abandoned can of grease went up in flames. Gasping in alarm, the German officer tried to kick the fire out, but the can skittered across the frozen snow. A British private lunged at the tin. His efforts only sent it careening towards his sergeant. One kick followed another. The tin bounced here and there, till at last someone had the good sense to snatch it with gloved hands, turn it over, and smother the flames. Laughter filled the night. The sergeant had a sudden idea. The football. He hastily made his way back to the British trench and recovered the spherical ball he had found a few weeks ago in an abandoned Belgian town. As he climbed from the trench, the soldiers looked to him with curiosity. But as the sergeant booted the ball towards an imaginary goal, he was no longer a sergeant on a battlefield. He had become Bert Freeman, the goal-scoring legend who played for Burnley that spring in the Vienna Cup. The German officer abandoned his flask and backpedaled from his fellows with a grin. He leapt into the air, and he became Max Fischer, the Hertha defenseman who had helped to foil Freeman and the squad from Burnley. Deftly heading the ball to the ground, it landed near a German soldier, and he became a forward, as he charged towards another imaginary goal. One by one, the soldiers took their positions, but they were no longer soldiers. They were boys and young men in their teens and 20s, playing a game in the snow. And for one night, the war was forgotten in Flanders Fields.
That was Michael Lang telling The Truce of Flanders Fields. I'm sitting down with Michael now to get some background on that story and see where it came from. Thank you, Michael.
Absolutely, Toby.
So where did this story come from?
Well, this story is historically inspired, as we said at the beginning, and historically, during World War I, the first year, 1914, there was a smattering of ceasefires in the weeks leading up to Christmas. They were all unofficial, and historians debate the details of what actually happened, but it is at least confirmed that along the front, during the weeks leading up to Christmas, there was an end to hostilities.
In the football match?
That is probably the most debated detail. Most historians agree that, at the very least, the soldiers of either side sat down in their own trenches and celebrated Christmas, but there are these documents from people's diaries and from their journals where they talk about meeting up in no man's land and celebrating Christmas, souvenirs being exchanged, food being shared, having a few drinks, and there are these scattered reports of football being played in no man's land. And there are a lot of arguments for why it couldn't have happened, why it could happen, but in the course of my research for this story, I found one particular article that was talking about a German officer from, I believe it was the 135th Prussian Infantry, who specifically wrote, "The British brought a football from their trench, and we played several games. It was a wonderfully marvelous but very strange thing." And that was what I latched onto when telling this story.
So you've done a lot of research for this story.
Yes. I spent about 3 weeks working on this story. Most of that was research time. Because I found, as I started trying to write this story, I didn't really know a lot about World War I. And as I worked at trying to set the stage for this story, what I realized was that I have a very strong connection to World War II and the era following that, thanks to my parents and my grandparents and other people that I know from those generations. But I don't really know anyone from the previous generation, the generation that would be my great-grandparents. And I realized that my knowledge of the 19-teens comes almost entirely from books and from documentaries. And I, at first, had to look up details about the war just to confirm that my impression of how this war was fought was anywhere near accurate.
So really a lot of that research was, in a storytelling or writing sense, world building, making sure that you had a handle on the setting.
The setting, absolutely. Yeah. That was my biggest challenge was, can I set the stage for this story? I had a good idea of what I wanted to say and how I wanted to present it, but capturing that context, getting an image in my head of what do these trenches even look like? Are they just holes in the ground? Are they built up? And the answer that I found was that it really depended on where you were along the front line. They could just be a mound of sandbags, or they could be an elaborate trench system with ladders leading up the sides. And I sort of latched onto one image in my head of the areas in Belgium of something that was kind of in the middle of those two extremes.
So you did about, I think you said 3 weeks of research.
Yes, at least.
And ended up with this, I think it was about a 5-minute story.
Yeah, right about that. It's about a page and a half written.
So normally when you take that long to write and research a story, it ends up being a lot longer. What made this one so short?
Well, when I finished the rough draft of this story, it was about 600 words in length, and that was my first impression was, wow, this is really short. I was expecting something much longer. And I went back and read through it and started thinking about the concepts I wanted to have in this story. I wanted to have some connections, whether subtle or obvious, to Christmas time in general. At the beginning of the story, we have all was quiet, even the rats were quiet. a reference to the classic holiday poem of Not a Creature Was Stirring, Not Even a Mouse, a biblical reference of the shepherds were standing watch over their flocks by night, having the sergeant be that shepherd over his squad. And as I read more and more about the war, I kept finding the poem in Flanders Fields. It's one of the most well-known writings about the war itself. And I decided I wanted to use some of the structure of that poem. The story begins and it ends with In Flanders Fields.
Mm.
And as I read through and continued thinking about the elements I wanted in this story, I realized they're all there. Nothing more needs to be said. And so I called the draft done and started working on revising.
And I know you did some revising on your own, and we did some revising here at the studio. And it's really very close to that original draft with just some real fine-tuning.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing this story with us, Michael.
Absolutely.
And to our audience out there, thank you for tuning in to Coyote's Corner. If you want to hear more from Michael, check out his website, coyotesinc.com, where he has a whole bunch of previous recordings. He has his bookings. You can see where he's performing live.
And as always, don't forget to like, favorite, and share this episode so you never miss anything that's going on here.
And from us here at Coyote's Corner, happy Christmas, happy Solstice, happy whatever it is you celebrate. We want you to celebrate it, enjoy it. So until next year, and until next time, this has been Coyote's Corner.